Today we'll be looking at persecution and the persecuted church. And one of the things that really shapes the early church is the setting of persecution, the persecution of Christians. The early church suffered repeatedly at the hands of those who hated them and hated who they stood for with Jesus Christ and what they stood for. That is the truth. And those who are unbelievers will oftentimes persecute those who they recognize as a threat, whether they are or not. Now, historically, persecution came first of all from the Jews. We see that with Stephen in the book of Acts, in Acts 7. And we see that with Saul of Tarsus persecutions, as Saul went about the land and persecuting the church. And then, obviously he was saved, as we see in the book of Acts in chapter 9. But it started off with the Jews, and that's where it really took off. And in fact, because of the Jewish persecution, it actually spread the church out throughout the land and into the rest of the Roman world, actually, in the first century with the apostles. So with the Jews first, and then from the Gentiles. And we see instances, even in the Bible, of the Gentiles persecuting Christians. We see that with Herod murdering James in 44 A.D. We see that with later on with Nero, who executed both Peter and Paul in the mid-60s of the first century. And then there were regional persecutions as well. Now, the exact number of persecutions is not really defined, but we can say for certain there were only two that were really spread over the entire empire, and that was the Decian or Decius Empire of about 250 AD. And then about 50 years after that, the Diocletian Empire in 303 to 311 AD. So here's what church historian Philip Schaff actually described the persecutions to be like. He said this. So this is Philip Schaff. The persecutions of Christians during the first 3 centuries appear like a long tragedy. First, foreboding signs, then a succession of bloody assaults of heathenism upon the religion of the cross, amidst the dark scenes of fiendish hatred and cruelty, the bright exhibitions of suffering virtue, now and then a short pause, at least a fearful and desperate struggle of the old pagan empire for life and death, ending in the abiding victory of the Christian religion. Thus, this bloody baptism of the church resulted in the birth of the Christian world. It was a repetition and prolongation of the crucifixion, but followed by a resurrection. And again, that's church historian from the mid-19th century, Philip Schaff. Now, the Roman government. When we go out into the Roman world in the first century and on into the second and third centuries, Christianity was legally an illegal religion from the time of Trajan on. So about 98 AD to on after that point. So right at the beginning of the second century, Christianity was legally an illegal religion. It was tolerated as long as it didn't draw attention to itself and as long as everything was going well in the empire. Pliny the Younger, whom you should have read or will read some of the things that he was dealing with, actually with Emperor Trajan. This governor of Bithynia asked the Emperor Trajan what he should do with the Christians. He wanted some advice to know what he should do with the Christians. He thought there were problems. He thought he smelt a rat. He thought he smelt something that wasn't quite right, but he wasn't sure what to do with them. And so he asked the emperor for advice in about 112 AD. And this is Trajan's response. And again, you can read more about that in your textbook. And this is what Trajan said. Christians are not to be sought out. Do not go looking for them, but if someone denounces someone as a Christian, then bring that person in and question them. And if that person refuses to recant and worship our gods, then they should be punished. And that became the general position of the emperors up until the time of Decius in 250 AD. So if the person refuses to recant and worship our gods, then they should be punished. So all it took was a jealous neighbor or an envious associate or someone who was spiteful, who didn't like you, to bring a charge against you, and they could call you Christian, and then you would be brought in for questioning. But persecution was always looming in the background, and so you always had this idea that there might be a rise in persecution. There is an amazing story of two young ladies, Perpetua and Felicitas, in about 198. And Perpetua was a 22-year-old young woman, a mother of an infant child, and she wrote in her diary while in prison in Carthage in North Africa. And the diary of Perpetua is probably the first writing that we have from a Christian woman. And as we read that amazing account of the witness of Perpetua in Carthage, whose father was pleading with her to denounce her faith, we can feel the tension here. She had to remain a Christian and reject the pleas of her pagan Roman father. And to the Romans, this was unthinkable for a woman to do. But she said this. This is what she said to her father. Father, do you see this water pot here, this bucket here, this water pot? And he said, yes, of course. And she said, well, that is what it is. It is not something else. Can it be called by any other name than what it is? And he said, no. And she said, then I cannot be anything other than what I am, and I am a Christian. Now that's an incredible story, isn't it? And I think it's incredible because she really stood firm on this point, where it would have been easy to cave in. I mean, here's her weeping father crying before her, asking her to just renounce her faith. Just do this. Think of your child. Think of your husband. Think of all of these things that you're giving up. Think of your love for me. And yet she stood fast. She stood firm for Christ. She knew she was going to suffer simply because she was a Christian, and she was willing to do that and to lay down her life because she knew that Jesus had promised persecution for his followers. Now for Trajan, the Emperor Trajan, he said no secret societies are allowed. No secret societies, including Christians. And Ignatius, under Trajan, was torn by beasts in Rome. Then there was another regional persecution under Antoninus Pius, and he was the one that persecuted and ended up martyring Polycarp in 156 AD. Then Marcus Aurelius, he was the one who martyred Justin Martyr. And then the Decius persecution from 249 to 251. And that was the most severe persecution until that time. It was a whole empire-wide. Most of the persecutions before that had simply been regional areas. So just in this particular region of North Africa, you would have this in Carthage. And then over in Asia Minor, you would have this persecution come up. But in the Emperor Decius in 249, put in the greatest persecution of the time. And during this persecution, many people buckled under the pressure. Many recanted their faith and tried to deny Christ in the midst of this. One of the things that came out of this persecution was that they began requiring a certificate saying that they had sacrificed to the emperor. And so what does that mean, sacrifice to the emperor? Well, they had many gods. The Romans had many gods. It's very much, would have been very much like what you experience in India with, all sorts of idols, all sorts of gods, all sorts of temples, and each to a different god. But the emperor was also seen as divine. And so they required people to just take a pinch of incense and put a pinch of incense and sacrifice to their god, the emperor. And if they could do that and sacrifice to the emperor, then they could get the certificate. And the certificate then was their pass to be able to buy and sell and do things like that. And this was called a libellus or a libelli. Plural would be libelli. And this mess of that being required to do a certificate by putting a pinch, and the Christians said, no, I'm not going to do that. Many of the faithful Christians said, no, I'm not going to put a pinch of incense before the emperor. And so many of them suffered and died. Well, others saw that happening, and they decided, well, I'll try and figure out what I can do. Maybe I can get a falsified libellus in order to be able to feed my family. Maybe I can do this, and just it's not a big deal. I'm not really sacrificing to a true God or a false God. I'm just going to put a pinch of incense in for him. And so there was a lot of compromise that took place after they saw lots of Christians being persecuted. Well, that led to many scared people, right? And I think one of the situations that we might experience in our lifetime is, what happens if they start doing vaccine passports and things like that, and requiring Christians to basically say to the state that, yes, I'm going to do this, and I am required to do this, and I will do that, with like a vaccine passport or something like that. Those could be things that are potentially in our day in order to buy or sell. If you don't have a vaccine passport, then you won't be able to buy food, and that's a concern that I think we have, at least in America. What are we going to do with that? And so in the 250s, this mess led to what was called the Donatist controversy. Okay, and so people would lapse away from that. Christians put a pinch of incense to the emperor in order to get out of the persecution, and then later on, after the persecution was done, these lapsed Christians, these Christians who had done that, wanted to come back to the church after the persecution. And so the question was, is there room for repentance and forgiveness over this? They had done this, and so what do we do with these people? And so therefore we have this Donatist controversy that comes out of the persecutions. The last great empire-wide persecution was Diocletian in 303 to 311, and it was greater than all the other edicts, and progressively got worse through time. So you had churches first being destroyed, and then Bibles being removed, and being required to turn your Bibles in to the government to be able to be destroyed. All Christians eventually were removed from public office, and they were forced to sacrifice to the gods if they wanted to maintain their life. And the church historian Eusebius witnessed this and wrote about it. Finally, the Edicts of Toleration by the Emperor Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius in 311 to 313, the Edicts of Toleration came about and ended the immediate persecutions that had been taking place. Now, the question that we need to wrestle with is really, why were they persecuted? Well, part of it is they were just seen as killjoys, somebody who didn't participate in all the fun, free lifestyle that people in the Roman Empire had, and so they didn't do what everybody else was doing. They lived and had this standard, and they didn't do what everybody else in the empire did, like going to the Colosseums, going to the theater, in participating in feasts, going to the temple to sacrifice with others, and then enjoy food and fellowship afterwards. And so they were seen as these killjoys who didn't do that. And so that's one of the things. So they were looked down upon because of kind of what they would perceive as being the strictness of their lifestyle. But interestingly, Christians were also considered to be atheists, and they were considered to be atheists because there were no visible gods. The Christians didn't have idols, in other words, to worship, and idolatry was seen as wrong. It's in the Ten Commandments, and so you don't make an image and bow down to it and worship that image because, Christians, that's the Ten Commandments say not to have any graven images, right? And so they were seen as being atheists. They were also considered atheists because they did not worship all the Roman gods or the major Roman gods. They did worship one God, but he is invisible, and so that didn't seem to count to the Romans. And so to the Romans, Christians were seen as atheists. At Polycarp's martyrdom, you remember when you were reading that he was in the stadium with the proconsul, and the crowd of people, if you remember, had come to see what would happen to him. And as they came to see what was going on with these Christians and to watch this and for their own enjoyment, the proconsul ordered Polycarp to say, "Polycarp, I want you to say, 'Away with the atheist,'" and implying that Polycarp was saying, "I am denying Christ, I am denying my faith." And so he said, "Say, 'Away with the atheists.' Just say, 'Away with the atheists,' and we will let you go." Well, Polycarp was not going to tolerate that. And so he looked up at the crowd, and he saw the crowd in the Colosseum, and he said, and these are all the pagans that are watching him, and he said, "Away with the atheists," pointing to all the crowd that was out there. And so obviously that didn't work, and Polycarp lost his life for the faith. Now, they were also charged with being cannibals. And so we think, cannibals? I mean, how could they charge them with being cannibals? But what people, maybe neighbors and all that heard was where it said, "This is my body, this is my blood," in the Lord's Supper. And so, people heard that and they knew that. And so it was thought, well, they must be eating and cannibalizing someone and drinking blood. Another charge that was leveled against the Christians was that they were incestuous. And so, they would greet one another with a holy kiss. They would call each other brother and sister. And so, and so they were participating together as brothers and sisters, and so they were seen as incestuous. Now, that was also a charge that was just a general charge. And all of these charges were sort of general charges that if they wanted to if the Romans wanted to make a charge against a group of people, those were charges that would be generally leveled at them as well. And so, not liking Christians, they could actually support some of these things with them in order to persecute them eventually and try and get them to conform. So those are the three main reasons why they were persecuted. Atheists, they called them atheists, they called them cannibals, and they charged them with incest. Now, there were other things. They were seen as disruptors of business, and you see that in Acts 19, and when Paul is preaching and disrupted they're in the temple of Artemis or of Diana, and they saw those who made idols of Diana and Diana or Artemis saw that as a disruption to their business, right? And they led a charge, and for 2 hours they cried out, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians," in the particular public sphere there. And so they were disruptors of business. They were seen as being anti-family, which is interesting for us to think about, because we don't think of Christians as being anti-family at all, do we? But in their day they did, because they saw in the scriptures where it says that we must forsake mother and father and husbands and wives in order to take up our cross and follow Christ. In the Roman world, you just didn't forsake your family. And so here's Perpetua, and her father pleading with her, "Don't forget me, don't forget your mother, don't forget your sisters, and what about your baby child," and all of these things. And so she was concerned about them, but her allegiance was first to Christ, and that meant she had to potentially deny her father even to maintain her, and even to maintain her place in that family. She was denying Christ. So if you, or not denying Christ, but denying her family instead. And so you see support for that in like places like Matthew 10:34 to 39. And so you can see how they would charge that maybe they were anti-family. They were charged with poverty because Christians oftentimes gave away or shared with others, and that they were just, and it also reached out into the lower classes of people and the lower castes, and so many people, kind of like in India, many of the Dalits in India become Christians, right? And so they were seen as this impoverished class, and they were less than the upper classes. So there is that. They were charged with causing the disasters of the Roman Empire, and so you have the floods that might occur, a volcano that might erupt, or maybe there were locusts or eating all the crops, and if any of those things happened, then the Christians were charged with that, and so they would rise up against the Christians, send the Christians to the lions, would become the cry. And this, in part, is why Augustine wrote The City of God, one of the major works that he wrote. There's also a more serious charge that really began to affect the Christians in every part of the empire during the Emperor Decius, and that was that these Christians refused to worship the emperor. And Christians did refuse to worship the emperor. The Jews did as well. But see, Jews had a special exemption for reasons, and that if you remember, I think Bob Godfrey talked about that a little bit, and some of the reasons why the Jews were allowed an exemption for not bowing to the emperor and those types of things. So the Jews were a nation, but the Christians were everywhere, and they came from all nations. They eventually were not exempt under the under a sect, being a sect of the Jews. And so the Christians' response was, we cannot worship the empire. We worship God alone. To worship the empire would mean that we are no longer Christians. We respect the emperor. We follow Romans 13, but the emperor is not God. And so they would respect him, but not worship him. And so that became a very big deal. So in the time of Decius, that became a huge thing. And so the emperors sent out their troops, and they're trying to get the Christians to conform. And one of the things that they would do was, which is quite scary, really, is they would come and put a sword to your throat, and put it right up to your throat, right next to your jugular vein, and they would say, Kyrios Kaiser, Kyrios Christus. That is Jesus Lord, or is Caesar Lord? Who do you worship? Do you worship Caesar, or do you worship Jesus Christ? And so that's kind of scary, isn't it? So what was the Roman state trying to do in persecuting Christians? A couple things. The main purpose was to cause Christians to conform, to cause Christians to apostatize and recant their faith and conform to the Roman way. And so that way we have the unity of the empire in our religion. And so that was very important to the Romans. We want the empire, our Roman Empire, to be unified in religion, and that means everybody being a patriot, everybody patriotically supporting the emperor and worshiping the empire and putting a pinch of incense and those things. So they wanted Christians to apostatize. So pressure was put on in many different ways and in various places in the empire to get them to do that. People at large, including Christians, if they were to get through the persecutions, as I said, were required to have that certificate, that libellus, and if you worshipped the emperor, you would get one of those, and so that became a big deal. And so because this was such an easy thing, Christians were tempted with that, just to get this light, but just put the pinch there. And some Christians did do that, and we need to think through, what would you do in a situation like that? What would you do if your government required that you do something like that? And again, that led to a controversy, the Donatist controversy. Can we be let back into the church? And so the church worked out how that could happen. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So the two main purposes of the persecution was to cause apostasy and to martyr the obstinate. And so they would put to death those who refused to bow the knee to the emperor, bow the knee to worshiping the emperor. And so we have Perpetua and Justin Martyr and Polycarp and all of these Christians who went to their death because of that. Now, what were the actual results of the persecution? Persecution doesn't make sense logically, but it is what happened in God's providence and sovereignty. Right? So God in his plan had this happen. I think we can summarize the results of persecution in the early church in these 2 points. Persecution purified the church, and persecution extended the church. So it purified those who were compromisers out of the church, and it extended the church by causing Christians to flee to different areas. And so the church grew as a result of persecutions. And you only have to read the New Testament a little to see that Christians must be prepared and organized for such things. Jesus said, if they persecute me, they will persecute you also. He said, you're not greater than your master. So Christians weren't surprised. They were expecting it. Jesus said in Matthew 5:10, blessed are those who persecute me because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And so the church was prepared for this by Jesus writing these things. And so there were those who simply were not saved, and they departed from the church and did not wish to repent. But persecution did purify the church because it cost something to be a Christian. Now, if you lived in a time or place like this, where the very fact that you are a Christian could give someone else grounds to accuse you and bring you before the judges, if that's what it meant to be Christian, then people will not consider Christianity lightly before converting to Christianity, will they? And they will realize that to be a Christian means I have to take up a cross and be crucified on it. I might face real persecution myself if I become a Christian. I may suffer at the hands of the lions. Now, Tertullian, that we brought up before, had some things to say about persecutions. And he said, God's winnowing fan, which even now cleanses the Lord's threshing floor. So that's what he said. It's God's winnowing fan, like when we winnow wheat and stuff like that and get the chaff out, right? So God's winnowing fan, which even now cleanses the Lord's threshing floor. Persecution would blow through and blow the chaff away and leave the good grain pure. In other words, persecution did purify the church. So Tertullian also said this famous quote, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Now, as we close, we usually think of the history of the early church as the time of persecution in the church. It was a time of persecution in church history. But people have said, and I think they're right, that the more people have been martyred that in the 20th century, in the past 100 years or so, that there have been more Christians martyred actually in our day than in all the years combined. And so it's pretty amazing in the last 100 years how many people have been actually suffering for Christ. And I think that shows that the gospel is spreading around the world. So in the last 100 years, there have been way more persecutions worldwide than there were in all those days in the early church, and probably all those days since the early church as well. So there are more Christians today spread out over all the world. We're coming to conflict with different cultures, and that results in persecution just like it did in the early church. And so part of the purifying of the church in persecution, some of the things to think about is, what do you believe? What do we believe about the faith? What do we believe about God? What do we believe about Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit? And what is what do we believe about persecution and the Bible saying about that? What do we believe about seeing Jesus Christ as the only way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to the Father except through him, that there is no other name under heaven by which someone may be saved except for Christ alone? So what do we believe? That's one of the things that persecution teaches us and causes us to really think about. And so in order to protect Orthodox doctrine at the time, Orthodox means right or true teaching. So what needed to protect that Orthodox teaching in the church? This is the time period when we really begin to see, because of persecution, because of heresies, we begin to see the development of creeds and confessions and catechisms to teach what the Bible says and to be a simple confession of what we believe. And so the first that developed, really a larger sort of creed, was that of the Apostles' Creed. And so the first 5 centuries involved really trying to understand the Trinity and the person and nature and work of Christ, and who is the Son of God. And so really those things really began to develop in the church at the time in order to be a confessional statement. And so as we move into the 2nd and 3rd centuries, we see those things beginning to develop, and they develop in order to really help people understand what they believe and to be a confession, and to really be able to, when they're getting baptized and things like that, to be able to produce this confession and to prevent heresy, but also to give Christians some strength to be able to memorize these things, to know who they love, who they stand for, who they are faithful to. And so that is persecution. It rose, and then eventually with Constantine was really put aside, and not much of a thing after Constantine.